Okay. Chapter 23, World War I. All right. Europe had been at peace ever since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. However, Europe was a continent of strong nations and weak. The nations of Europe did not trust each other, and they had strong feelings of nationalism. The British were really strongly for Britain, the Germans were strongly for Germany, and the union of Italy and Germany led to even stronger feelings of nationalism. There was a lot of internal strife, particularly the socialists. The socialists would encourage rebellion and encourage strikes, and the strikes were often bloody. Now, here is what really wound up leading to World War I. The nations of Europe lined up into treaty organizations. Two big treaty organizations, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Essentially, Europe was all lined up on two sides, just waiting to be, waiting for something to send them off. The Triple Entente was made up of Germany, Austria, and Italy. Triple Alliance, Britain, France, and Russia, primarily. Now,
Mason,
yes.
based on the book, the Triple Alliance, they are Germany, Australia, and...
Oh, maybe I've gotten it backwards. So let me verify that. I think I made this mistake before. The Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria, and Italy. Thank you. Triple, thank you. I'll stand corrected. I do have it right in my notes, but I got myself mixed up. All right, Triple Entente, Triple Alliance. Three big countries involved here. Now, what this meant was if a war ever broke out, it was going to be bad. Well, all that was needed was something to, like a fuse, that would blow off the fuse and get the war started. Well, it did happen. The Balkan region had often become a fuse, and it was to serve as a tinderbox again. In 1914, a Serbian, and this occurred, by the way, right around July, right about this time, the heat of summer. A Serbian shot the heir to Austria's throne, Archduke Ferdinand, and his wife. Archduke Ferdinand was the only son of the Austrian emperor, and he was shot dead. Austria blamed the Serbians. Now, Russia was Orthodox Catholic, so was Serbia, and folk, it's this day in 2019, the Russians still look out for the interests of these people in Serbia. Still yet. Anyway, Austria began to make demands on Serbia, demands that Serbia could not meet. So Austria started a war with Serbia. Then Russia joined in on this side, When Russia joined in, Germany joined in on Austria's side. Well, because France had this treaty with Russia, France joined in. So when Germany started fighting France, it went through Belgium, not knowing that Belgium had had a secret treaty for generations. The Germans went through Belgium to get to France, not knowing that Belgium had a secret treaty for generations with Britain, so the British joined in. Britain joined in against Germany. So basically you have Austria, Germany, eventually Italy joined in on the German side. This was the beginning of World War I. The United States initially stayed out of it. But there's a story that was told in my high school history book about two American boys. This was before the school bus came into widespread use. These two boys were walking home from school one day. One of them said to the other, "Are you aware that the heir to Austria's throne was shot dead?" The one boy said, "Well, so what?" "Yeah, but don't you realize that this will mean war?" The one boy said, "Well, listen, Europe can blow itself to 1,000 pieces. It's none of my business." The two boys began talking about baseball and about other things, you know, that young boys will talk about. But not so the young boys and girls of Europe. As for this young boy who said the war was none of his business, you might have guessed it, he died fighting in the trenches in France. So anyway, the United States stayed out of it first. Germany had this Schefflin plan that had been in place for years, where the Germany would go around the French defenses and go through Belgium. And it would have worked, except that Belgium called on Britain to help them. So the British got involved. The Germans said, "You were going to war over a slip of paper." Anyway, World War I broke down into a trench stalemate. Now, when the war started, nobody envisioned it would last for 4 years. Now, oh yeah, it was true that across the Atlantic, the American Civil War had lasted 4 years. But the few wars Europeans had had, the Franco-Prussian War had lasted through one battle and whoop, it's over. The Crimean War, 1 or 2 battles and that one was over. So they believed one battle. In fact, Europeans believed that what we need is just one war, one quick war, and then all of our troubles will be over and Europe will settle. But at first, some of them thought, well, rational diplomats will bring about an end to war, and they thought also man is too civilized to fight. They believed that morality was getting better and better, folk. We'd argue that back in 1971 when I went to UT, is morality getting better and better. But they argued that morality was getting better, but World War I did a lot to convince us. Our technology might have improved, our medicine might have improved, but our morals are the same as they always were. Again, that can be argued. Anyway, World War I bogged down into a trench, so the trench proved to be the worst weapon man had ever devised. Essentially, you had a trench over here and a trench over here. On the one side was one country, on the other side was the other. In between was an area called no man's land, and the trench stalemate could not be broken. Now, the trenches developed problems with rats. The rats, it was said, were so big that the cats were even afraid of them. I mean, this might be a slight exaggeration. But also, when it rained, the trenches would often collapse and cave in and suffocate the men whom they caved in on. Neither side could break the stalemate. Sometimes one side would just come over the trench and try their best to dislodge the enemy. They might gain a few hundred yards and then be forced back. And this went back and forth for 4 years, while more than 1 million men died of the French, more than 2 million Germans, more than 1 million or 2 million Russians, more than 1 million Austrians, and at least 900,000 British, and only 50,000 Americans. Now, the Americans' role in World War I, it was big, but it didn't come about till late. And I recall when I was young, so many of the older people were veterans of World War II, and I finally asked my mother one time, "Mom, was there ever a World War I?" Oh, yes, there was. We Americans somewhat tended to forget about World War I after a time, but the fact is, there really was. World War I actually changed Europe more than World War II. World War I ended the 4 emperors that I talked about. Well, ended the Ottoman Empire, ended the Austrian Empire, and broke the hold of the nobility throughout much of Europe, wherever it touched. World War I made more permanent changes to Europe than did World War II. Anyway, for 4 years they battled trench warfare. Almost all of Europe took sides, but some of the smaller countries got in and out of the war quickly. Hungary, for instance, was in and out of the war in 4 months, having been clobbered. The book doesn't mention that, but mostly the war was a stalemate. Your book shows a picture of some women sending their husbands and boyfriends off to war, and they look like they're going to a picnic. Short war and it'll all be over. No, long, long war that killed millions of you, and most of them never returned. It has been said that every European who enlisted in 1914 died on the battlefield. Every European who enlisted in 1915 died. A few who enlisted in 1916 survived. And most who enlisted in 1917 also survived. And by 1918, most of them survived. But what finally broke the trench warfare was the invention of the tank. But that came about late. Late in the war, Great Britain developed the tank. Airplanes were used for the first time, but those airplanes were mostly made of balsa wood, single-engine prop craft that could only fly about 70 or 80 miles an hour. But eventually someone got the idea of shooting at an enemy plane from his plane, and the idea caught on, so these men would do dog fights in the air where one plane would knock out another. And this led to air fights. All right. Germany had to fight on two fronts. There was a Western Front and the Eastern Front. The generals were not prepared to fight this kind of war. Now, I have a book at home where the author says that generals trained their troops real hard to fight the last war. And when I joined the Army in 1980, we were training for Vietnam, and the Vietnam War had been over for 7 years. We were still training for Vietnam. But anyway, the generals will train their troops to fight the last war. But they were prepared for a type of war where there'd be maneuvers and flanking movements. Not this. The trench warfare eliminated all chance of any kind of fancy maneuvers, flanking maneuvers, any kind of strategy. Just simply get in there and slug it out and slug it out. Ask for more equipment. Each side thought if they could just get a few more men, a few more machine guns, a few more cannon, but the other side got the same thing. Now, the Eastern Front was Germany fighting against Russia. Now, you notice I said the Western Front was Germany and Austria fighting against France and Britain. The Eastern Front was Germany and Austria fighting mostly against Russia. Germany made the mistake in World War II of fighting a two-front war. The fact is, Germany did not have the resources to fight a two-front war, but Germany was fighting on both fronts. The British tried to open up a Balkan front. They failed. And yes, the man who led the Balkan front was Winston Churchill himself, and this was to wind up hurting Winston Churchill's popularity temporarily. Eventually, Churchill's popularity recovered. Anyway, on the Eastern Front, Germany won the war against Russia. All right. Then Italy. Now, here's the betrayal, big betrayal. Italy was part of the Triple Alliance. They were supposed to have joined with Austria. Instead, Italy switched sides and joined the war against Germany. Against Germany and against Austria. My freshman teacher asked us if there were any Italians in the room. I'm not going to ask that. Italy's performance in both world wars is so bad that it would make any Italian ashamed. So if you're Italian, you can keep it to yourself. I don't need to know it. Essentially, Italy was so bad that it was said that Italy was of more value to the Triple Alliance of fighting on this side than they would have been fighting on this side. They were a serious liability. The other nations of Europe had to take their troops from the front lines and send them to help Italy, while Italy's armies lost. Right now, no, nothing against the Italian soldier. Everyone you read about will say that the problem was the high up leadership in Italy. And it's the same thing applies to World War II. Italy in World War II sided with Hitler, and Italy contributed greatly to Hitler's defeat. Yes, you heard me right. Italy did side with Hitler, and Italy contributed to Hitler's defeat. It's like having a player on your team whom you call an outmaker. Every time he comes up to bat, you can count on an automatic out. He does the other side more good than he does his side. Basically, that's what Italy was in both world wars. A liability. Anyway, Italy betrayed Austria, joined in to fight against Austria, but they were more a liability than they were a help. Germany and Austria did eliminate Serbia from the war. They clobbered Serbia. The other nations, France and Britain, had to send troops to help Italy. Now, finally, in 1917, 3 years into the war, Russia pulled out. But that's a subject for probably the next lecture. Russia pulled out. But we're going to talk more about Russia's role and why they pulled out. Essentially, Russia developed a communist ideology, and Lenin took over. But that is part of this chapter also. But now we come to the United States. I was asked one time, why did the United States side with Germany? Why did the United States side with Britain and France instead of Germany? There were several reasons. But when the war broke out, we had a lot of Germans living in the United States, and they were pro-Germany. Well, our president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson, said that the United States was going to remain neutral during the war. Okay, sounds like a great plan. And then, in modern economics, you have periods called recessions. A recession hit the United States, brought on by the fact that the United States did not trade with European countries at war. And President Wilson decided that, well, let's trade with Great Britain anyway. So he began to trade with Great Britain. The Germans responded by sinking a lot of American ships. And they sunk several ships, and this helped turn the United States against Germany. Some Americans were killed when the ships were sunk. Now, there was another thing that turned the United States against Germany, the Zimmermann letter. Zimmermann was the German ambassador to Mexico, and one day he sent a telegram to the Mexican government that was intercepted by the British, and the British gave the telegram to the United States, and the United States published it in its newspapers. Here's what the telegram said. The telegram was sent to Mexico. All right. Germany offered to Mexico, saying, if you, Mexico, will allow us to use Mexico as a base of operations in a war with the United States, we'll give you back California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, all that territory. They'd read your history books. All that territory that the United States took from you, we'll give it back. Now, the Mexicans hated the United States. Why the Mexicans refused, I don't know, but the Mexicans refused the offer, and there's one reason I can think of why Mexico would have refused the offer. They didn't believe Germany would win. If they were thinking along those lines, they were being smart. But the Mexicans apparently, it was not that we fought a war with Mexico, we'd taken thousands of square miles of territory from Mexico, and we were still fighting against Mexicans. And we sent our General Pershing down to Mexico to try to capture the Mexican president, and he couldn't do it. And again, the Mexicans knew their hideaways better than we did. We Americans didn't know them. But anyway, the Zimmermann telegram, well, they asked Ambassador Zimmermann, did you really send this? They're expecting Ambassador Zimmermann would say, no, I didn't. Instead, yes, I did send it. It was a genuine offer from the German government to Mexico. Well, this turned Americans against Germany. But the real thing that really got Americans riled was the sinking of the Lusitania. I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit. Not too long ago, the Lusitania was found at the bottom of the North Sea. Some divers, having found it, wanted to go down and look it over. The British government ordered, no, do not. So the Lusitania still sits there now. The story is told that the Lusitania was a passenger ship that was secretly carrying munitions to aid the British in their fight against the Germans. If the Germans knew that the Lusitania was really carrying munitions, the Germans were fully justified in sinking it. I mean, you understand, this was an act of war. So the Germans were justified. Anyway, the Germans were excellent spies and made excellent espionage. Now, when it came time to set sail, nobody wanted to take the responsibility for signing the paperwork, so it goes up the chain of command. Everybody went to pass the buck. The buck went up to President Wilson's desk himself. Went to the Oval Office. Harry Truman and Jimmy Carter both had a sign on their desk, the buck stops here. President Wilson could not pass the buck. He either had to sign or not. President Wilson signed the paperwork that authorized the Lusitania to set sail. Then it all went back down the chain of command and the Lusitania set sail. The Lusitania almost got to Great Britain when it was hit by German submarines, U-boats, sunk with more than 100 Americans on board. The United States still did not go to war, maybe because Wilson probably knew that the Lusitania was possibly carrying munitions. This has not been finally proven, but as time goes on, we believe it more and more. But we still did not go to war. But then the Germans for a while stopped sinking and shipping. Then they started it up again. And at this point, Woodrow Wilson decided he had enough, so he called both houses of Congress into the House of Representatives side. If you know anything about the Congress, the Senate is not big enough to house both houses. So he called the senators and the representatives of one side of Congress, and he asked for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. It was also called the War to End All Wars. Now, ironically, since World War I ended, there has not been 1 second on this planet but what there hasn't been a war going on somewhere. World War I was called the War to End All Wars. It didn't. But anyway, Woodrow Wilson asked for a declaration of war. Woodrow Wilson was not a military man, so he left a lot of it to the generals. The general we chose to lead our armies was General Pershing. JJP, John Joseph Pershing. Pershing went to France, got to France and asked for 1 million men. He wound up getting 2 million. Well, eventually the United States held more than even the British did, held more of the line. When the Germans made an attack, they initially defeated the French, and as the French army bumped into the Americans while the French were running full speed from the battlefield, the French told the Americans, "Run, run, they're after us." And the American soldiers reported to have said, "No, we just got here. We're not going to run." It was the Americans who stopped the German advance. Second Battle of the Marne. But anyway, to make a long story short, shortly after the United States entered the war, a British man named Lawrence of Arabia he was a friend of the Arabs, even though he was a Britisher. He went to the Arab sheiks and persuaded them to rebel against the Ottoman Empire. What this meant was that Great Britain and France had all the oil, and the Germans actually literally ran out of gas. And even as long ago as 1918, running out of gas meant you had to surrender. It meant their trucks couldn't move, their supplies couldn't move, their airplanes couldn't get off the ground, their troops could not move. But the German armies literally ran out of gas. They began to retreat, and they realized that these fresh American soldiers who had just arrived they could not handle. Without the United States, there is a chance that Germany might have won. Actually, it's a big chance. There's only a small chance that France and Britain would have won without the United States. The United States moved in and turned the tide of the battle and changed the outcome of the war. When it became obvious that Germany was going to lose, President Wilson sent a message to Europe demanding that the Kaiser of Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm, abdicate, which he did. Now, here's the story about what happened to German people, and it was a psychological blow. The German people were told over and over again, we're winning. And it is true. No foreign troop ever entered inside Germany in World War I. Now, that's not true in World War II. But in World War II, both the Russians entered from the east and the Americans and Canadians and French and British entered from the west. That was World War II. But in World War I, no foreign army invaded inside Germany's borders. And also in 1917, Germany told its people that Russia had surrendered, which was true, that Russia had pulled out of war. That way it said we can now concentrate on defeating the Western Front, on winning the Western. That was all true. The German people went to bed one night being told they were winning and got up the next morning and told that Germany had surrendered, their Kaiser had abdicated, and it was a shock. That ultimately was to lead to World War II. The Germans said, hey, well, I thought we were the best, I thought we had the most, we were the superior, we were the Aryans. The master race thing was nothing new, folk. It was not just something Hitler propagated. It was going on before the war. But anyway, it was a shock that ultimately was to lead the German people to raise up arms and fight again. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. Now, there was a clause in that Treaty of Versailles that the Germans hated that said that Germany was to take the blame for starting the war. Today, we look back on it and say, no, Germany did not really start it, but Germany did not do all that Germany could have done to prevent it. And if you read that, the book has letters that were written between the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany. And to me, it looks like both those men, they were first cousins, the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, both of them grandsons of Queen Victoria of England. That both men were itching, like my dad would say, itching for a fight. Both men wanted a fight, and you could say both men lost. All right. The date of the armistice, and we celebrate this date, November every November 11th. Now, I served in the National Guard for 6 years, so all I have to do is show my discharge papers and I can get a free meal. I say free because by the time I bring my wife and family along, it's a highly expensive meal. But anyway, because I once served. But on November 11th, we celebrate Armistice Day, and where we again honor our veterans who have fought in our wars. Regrettably, November 11th did not end all wars. All right, Russia. Now, I won't have time to figure out, but we're finished with Russia. I'm going to start with it. The war was going badly for Russia. They were fighting on Germany's Eastern Front. The Russian armies were obsolete and out of date and no match for the better equipped German army. And they were losing all over the place. The thing about Russia, though, is it's huge. It's very large. Well, the socialist parties formed and they demanded that the war come to an end right now. Tsar Nicholas II, unlike the other kings of Europe, he personally led the army, even though he was not a qualified leader of men, but he personally led the army, trying to get Russia to win. But Russia was not ready to fight a modern war. The Russian army had not developed any kind of plans for mobilization. The roads in Russia, yes, in the wintertime they'd freeze over hard, you could drive on them. I'm from the north, I know what it's like to go on a dirt road that's frozen hard, and then go on that same road when it starts to thaw, and you can easily get stuck. It was said that in Russia, mud could get up to 4 feet deep. You can't drive a truck on that, folk. Now today they have paved roads, so they're in better shape, but Russia was not ready to fight. Tsar Nicholas II became more and more dictatorial, and the result was more and more rebellion. Just like was the case I talked about earlier, where that in China they had more rebellion, which made them more dictatorial, which rebellious, which made him more dictatorial. Tsar Nicholas II did the same thing. He was neither in charge of his government nor his palace. Now, into this scenario stepped a man, and really I'm going to have to close, named Rasputin. I'll talk more about Rasputin next time, but my wife and I watched, my wife and daughters watched a movie about Anastasia one time, and she came home and asked me, was there really a Rasputin? I said, yes, there really was a Rasputin. And the last book I read was about Rasputin. I mean, I don't read books much anymore. Most of the reading I do comes from the internet. The last book I read was about Rasputin. There have been persons who have said that they believe, I mean, folk, you can take this for whatever you will, that Rasputin might have been demon-possessed. There are persons who have said all kinds of stuff about it, but he did a lot to bring down the Tsar's family and to wind up getting the Tsar in from a firing squad. Yes, Rasputin was finally killed, but it was too late to save the government. If he had been killed earlier, perhaps the story might have had a different ending. What I'm about to talk about, folk, is the story of the communist takeover of Russia. But we're out of time, and I finally feel like I've caught up. For the last 2 or 3 classes I got behind, but I finally caught up to where I'm supposed to be. So anyway, with that, if any of you think you're going to need to leave,